On to research methods. So we started at hypotheses and variables. So first thing that we need if we are going to do research method is some sort of hypothesis. So what is our theory? Remember, I had the theory in class that people listen to music to help them study. Okay, so if I've got my hypothesis, then I need to think about what my aim is going to be. All right, so am I investigating the types of music people listen to? Am I investigating how many people listen to music? Am I investigating how successful that makes them by listening to it? Am I investigating how distracted they become, right? So there are all these different sorts of ideas. Now, we in class did the balls in the bucket experiment, right? So we take our aim and put it into this hypothesis that we are going to use. So we, in class, it was to investigate whether performance on a task, throwing balls into a bucket, is affected by an audience being present or not. And then remember, we talked about independent and dependent variables. Okay, so independent variable is the thing that is deliberately changed. Okay, and the dependent variable is the thing that is measured, right? I think you know all of this from science. You certainly seem to when we were talking about it in class, right? And we can adjust things and move things around. So we then need to have a testable hypothesis. So we need to think, right, have we got everything in there? Have we got variables? Is there a relationship between things, right? So we might need to change it. There is a difference in the number of balls thrown into a bucket out of 20 by participants performing with an audience of 30 people or performing the task alone, right? So now we're starting putting numbers in to make it a bit more precise. Right, so then of course we can repeat this study at a later stage to make sure that what we have found out is reliable. All right, remember there are two types of hypotheses. So there is an alternative hypothesis, right? So this is the idea, right, that you have two things contrasting against each other. So with an audience and without an audience, right? That's the alternative hypothesis. Okay, if we look at a null hypothesis, this is when we say there is no difference. Okay, there is no change if you change these different things, right? So those are our two different types of hypotheses. Don't think when we say an alternative hypothesis that you have to write something completely new. It is just comparing everything. All right, next we talk about extraneous variables. Okay, so these are the things that are outside of our control. So that might be a loud bang that happens outside that distracts people. It might be the mood that somebody is in. It might be the abilities that people have already before they come to do an experiment with you. So when we are looking at the procedures, we have to be really careful with our research procedures. We have to make sure that we have very clear instructions. Okay, we have to make sure that we have standardized procedures, right? So everyone should be given the same information, identical instructions, yeah, and preferably that people are tested in the same environments as well. And there can be problems with extraneous variables with that one. And then we can use randomization. Okay, so this idea of using chance in the way that we're doing, in the way that we're looking at things, right? So we might choose students at random from a group in a classroom. We might choose the list of words that we ask them to memorize at random, that sort of thing, yeah? Okay, so then we've gone on to types of experiments. So remember, we are looking for quantitative and qualitative methods, and we are looking at quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative is to do with numbers, qualitative is to do with thoughts and feelings and whatever else, okay? So experiments are quantitative approaches because they will give us a lot of numbers that we have from what we've collected. Yes, right, so we can have laboratory experiments, so things that are very much in a controlled environment. Okay, so this takes away extraneous variables, but at the same time it's got low ecological validity because it's not the sort of place that people are used to being in. Right? Remember, what does validity mean? It means that validity is that the information that you collect is actually relevant to the study that you are doing. All right, we could therefore use field experiments. So these now take place not necessarily in a field, but in a natural setting. So if I want to know about the type of food that people eat at lunchtime, I don't put them into a laboratory and give them a whole range of different foods. I watch people as they are collecting food from the canteen, as they're opening up their lunch boxes, so that I can find out that information. So obviously a strength of this is much more realistic. However, people don't always necessarily realise that they are being watched. And you can still follow standardized procedures though with it, okay? Obviously the big weakness with this is that you can lose control over extraneous variables in a real life setting, and the ethical issues could take over as well. Then we have natural experiments. So this is when the change in the IV is just happening anyway, whether we are interested or not. So I'm just reading what this said. Yeah, okay. So, for example, a researcher might want to know if girls or boys are happier. Gender is the IV, but this would not be changed by the experimenter, right? But if we're talking about throwing the balls into the bucket, remember we said, but if you've practiced beforehand, or if you've done it in front of the class and then you do it on your own outside, that could make a difference because that's the practice that you've been having while you are getting on with it, right? So natural experiments have high validity because it's about real life changes. It's not something that we are controlling as the experimenter. But the weakness is that it might happen only very rarely. So it's actually quite infrequently that people can actually do this type of experiment. Okay, then we looked at experimental designs. So remember, this is very important that you remember how you actually design the way that you are doing an experiment. So we have independent groups. Yeah, so I mean, it is exactly what it says on the tin. You may have a control group, and then the other is the experimental group, and then you can compare between the two, but they're not linked to each other at all. They won't necessarily know that this is going on. That takes away that order effect, right? So it might be that you just test one group in front of an audience throwing balls into a bucket, but the other group you test not in front of an audience, and then you compare the two together. However, of course, the weakness with that is that you don't know what the ability of the people is in each group. Yeah, so you may try to change this kind of idea of allocation of conditions, right? So you might say, okay, I'm going to put you here, you there. I might flip a coin to decide who goes there, right? But that's still not taking into account what the ability of those people actually is, right? That only happens when we go on to matched pairs, which we'll look at in a minute. Then we have repeated measures. So this is where we can comparing like with like. If we're throwing the balls into the bucket with an audience, we also throw balls into the bucket without an audience being present. So then you end up with two sets of results. okay, that you can then compare between the different groups. So a strength of it is that participant variables is removed because you see them in both scenarios. And you don't need as many people as in the independent group because that one group is doing both of the research tasks. But obviously we do have order effects. Okay, so that was what we talked about when we went out to deal with it. So it's this idea of, okay, do we test, we did different groups and then came back and compared. So one of us had done it with audience first on their own and then on their own, and the other did it on their own first, audience afterwards, so that we could compare our results. So that's where you have to deal with counterbalancing, okay, and this happens in repeated measure designs, and that's what we were doing. So we swapped it around so that we were counterbalancing this effect from previously, and so then it also is this controlling of the conditions. Right, so it's just us trying to make it as scientific as possible. All right, then we go on to matched pairs. So this is your kind of halfway house, if you like, right? But so what you do is you test people first of all to see how good they are at throwing balls in the bucket, and then you divide up all the people who got 5 out of 5. So let's say 3 of them did it, you put 2 in one group and 1 in the other, and then who got 4 out of 5, so let's say there's 3 again, so you put 2 of those with the 1 who got 5 and the and the 1 with the 2 5s. So you start to average it out, so you should end up with people with the same abilities in both groups. So now it becomes much easier to compare. You take out order effects, you take out the variables that could be in there as well. Okay, but it does take a long time and it can never be exact. So for example, I was saying there are 3 people who get 5 out of 5. You can't then have 1.5 on each group, can you? All right, so then we've gone on to look at different methods for research. So we looked at sampling. All right, so remember with sampling you must talk about your target population and therefore your sample frame that you put down. Okay, so I might want to know something about all teenagers in the world, but I haven't got the time or the money to be, or maybe the inclination, to be able to test every teenager in the world, right? So instead I go into a target population. So I might say, right, well, I'm just going to test all the teenagers in the UAE. And then I'll use those. Now, this can obviously cause to some sort of level of bias and a lack of representativeness. However, you know, somewhere like the UAE is actually a great place to use because you've got a mix of cultures and a mix of experiences going on here. All right, so we could use random sampling. Again, it's what it says on the tin. Everybody has an equal chance of being selected. You stick everybody's name in a hat, you pull them out. Right, so hopefully with this there's no bias, you've all got an equal chance of being selected. It does take a bit more time and effort than others, and you've got to get your list together beforehand and whatever else. And then when you pull the names out of the hat, the people might not be willing to actually do what you've asked them to do. Of course, the other problem could be that you could pull all females' names out of the hats, or all males' names out of the hat, or people over a certain age, whatever else, right? All your teenagers could actually just be 13 and not really have much experience of being a teenager. Okay, then we can use opportunity sampling. So this is where we just pick the people who happen to be there. Right, now I would say that in Bartlett's War of the Ghost Theory, he used opportunity sampling, right, because he just picked his friends and he got them to do it. Right, so it is relatively easy to do because it's just people who are nearby. So it's quick and it's cheap, but it is unrepresentative of the population generally because you're only drawing them from one place. Then we can use systematic sampling, right? So this is where we pick every nth name for from our sample frame, right? So we might pick every 5th person or every 20th person, depending on how big the sample frame is, right? And we ask them to do the tasks. So again, this takes out researcher bias, but again, it can still be biased because you might end up with all males or females or whatever else, right? So it's not representative. So then we use stratified sampling. So we put layers into our target, God almighty, into our sampling frame, sorry. We put layers into it, and then we work out each of those layers, what their frequency is within society. Okay, so let's say, for example, the layers we put in are gender, the age, race, right? If we then go, all right, well, 40% of the population are males and 60% are females in our sample frame, then the number of females we have to have has to represent 40%. So if we're testing 50 people, then 20 of them have to be males and 30 of them have to be females. Yep. Okay, so this is the most representative form of sampling, but the subgroups could still be putting bias into what we're doing, and it is a very lengthy process. And if you're not as good at maths as Maggie is, then you won't be able to work out as quickly how many people you're going to need. All right, next thing we looked at were ethical considerations, one of our favourite things, right? So remember, there are a lot of ethical issues. Earlier tests and experiments that were done in psychology were extremely unethical. So the British Psychological Society put in a group of a list of guidelines to make sure that people were being ethical in what they did. All right, so now we have informed consent. A person has to know what you're studying, they have to agree to be a part of it, and know that they can withdraw at any point. We also have to avoid deception if we've lied or misled people through what we are doing. Now, you could have some mild deception so that people still behave in a natural way, as long as you debrief them afterwards. Okay, we can't put people into a position of harm or at risk. We have to take into account their privacy, and also we have to offer them the chance for confidentiality. So everything is anonymous, they wouldn't be named in what's going on. All right, and yeah, the BPS guidelines cover all of that. I think we understand that. All right, then on to interviews and questionnaires. Remember, interviews can be structured, unstructured, semi-structured. So you might have an interview where you have a set of questions, those are all you ask. If it's unstructured, you have a theme and you just go with the flow of what the person is saying. You might have 1 or 2 questions to start you off. Semi-structured, you use a combination of the two. Okay, that might mean that a person doesn't tell you that much, so you need extra questions to move the conversation forward. But what it can also do is it gives you quantitative and qualitative data if you're using semi-structured. Strength of interviews is that they do produce extensive information. Good follow-up questions will help you to find out all sorts of stuff. And yeah, you know, people are sometimes much better at expressing themselves orally than they will be on writing it down. However, of course, there are other people who much prefer to write things down, and they can be very difficult to analyse because obviously quantitative data is always going to be much more difficult to analyse, and you may also get interviewer bias in what is in the way that questions are led, because of the interviewer may then ask sort of leading questions or questions that show what they understand by what the person said, but actually the person might have meant something completely different. And some people are going to feel embarrassed at telling somebody about distressing topics or whatever else. So then we can use questionnaires. So we know we have open and closed questions. So open questions where people can express their opinions, so getting quantitative data. Closed questions where it's yes, no, or tick the box that most relates to the answer that you think is right. Obviously, a strength of this is that you can get lots of information relatively quickly from people. It does take a little while to prepare the questionnaire and make sure that it's right, but it's much easier to analyse than interview data, much quicker again than doing interviews. So therefore, it's also cheaper. Weaknesses are that people don't necessarily answer them truthfully. They're not necessarily going to answer an interview question truthfully either. And also, they might just give the answer they think you want. If it's a closed question, it might not have the answer that they actually want to give, so they have to pick the one that is closest to it. So again, that's going to question the validity of what you're doing. All right, then we went on to observation studies. So we have different types of observation studies, naturalistic versus controlled. So do we watch people in like a field experiment, or do we watch them in a lab experiment? Covert versus overt. So is it hidden from them that they're being watched, or are we honest with them? And there are problems there because people behave differently when they know they're being watched. Do we do participant versus non-participant? So if I'm observing a lesson and I'm sitting at the back of the class, I'm non-participant, right? I'm watching everybody else, but I could join in that lesson, and as your teacher in the class, I could be observing you without you knowing. So that's covert and participant, yeah? So we maybe will look at things like categories of behaviour. They're very easy to observe. And what we do need to have is inter-observer reliability. So if you have two people doing the observations and then you compare afterwards, that's much more reliable. Okay, and because interviewer bias or observer bias could come into this at this point. So I see someone crying, I assume they're unhappy, right? I often cry because I've laughed too much, right? So it's not a case that I'm unhappy, I'm just laughing way too much. Observation studies do give a better indication of behaviour than questionnaires or interviews do. And they also look at real life behaviour, but obviously there are ethical issues in not letting people know they're being watched. It could be an invasion of privacy. We may have expectations from what we see and hear, and so there are your problems with that. Okay, then we looked at correlations. Yep, so this idea that we will have an association between two variables. So you will have your covariables, which you then put into a scatter diagram, and then you will see positive correlations, negative, and zero correlations. Yeah, so it's, you know, all of this from maths, which is why I'm just jumping through it quickly. Yeah, so you will know if there are one variable increases as the other increases, so that's positive. If they go down, it's negative. If there's no correlation, then your dots will just be scattered all over the place, right? The strength of this is that correlations give us a good starting point for research, right? So we would go, oh, okay, yeah, there definitely is a correlation there, so this is something that we need to research further. And we may also say, right, well, there are obviously more complex relationships here. There was no correlation here, but there are correlations when we change these things, so that's what we need to research and not this area. So you might not always get it right with the variables that you use, so that can be a weakness of it, and intervening variables need to be looked at. Okay, so it's talking here about if you look at stress, that you can't necessarily take in all the other intervening things. So we might say that stress is due to a particularly difficult job that people do. But there could be all sorts of other things that are going on, like problems within their family, or low income, or whatever else. Okay, then we went on to case studies. So this is where we do an in-depth, sometimes longitudinal research into something. Okay, so this is a qualitative method where we are finding out people's experiences. I mean, we'll have some quantitative data in there as well, but it will kind of work much better over a long period of time. And obviously you are now doing some case studies, or have done some case studies by the time you listen to this, on serial killers. So you know that you can do this over a short period of time, because there is a lot of secondary data that is available for you to be able to research from, and primary data if you could get your hands on a serial killer and actually talk to them, right? So the strength of this is that case studies, you're often more open-minded. You haven't got a particular hypothesis, you're just trying to go into depth research on them. And it is also a really useful way of studying unusual forms of behaviour. So hopefully serial killers are unusual, right? However, a weakness is if they are concerning unique types of people, then it doesn't give us general ideas for the whole population, right? So if you've ever seen the film Silence of the Lambs or read the book, the whole point is that they bring in a detective who's had experience of cannibalism in the past, and then they go and they talk to somebody who's been convicted of cannibalism, who is Hannibal in Silence of the Lambs, and they ask him to get inside the mind of this person who is committing crimes now, right? So and obviously it is very subjective, and that's why you would need to do something like that. Okay, we have then moved on to reliability and validity. Okay, so remember, reliability is that we can test things many times and get the same results. That's much easier with quantitative methods like experiments, interviews, questionnaires and observation. Qualitative methods, much more difficult to be reliable. However, qualitative methods are much more likely to be valid, right? So they actually reflect what's happening in the real world and in that person's life, and they give us details that actually answer what we are questioning, right? So we would use things like sampling methods, change our experimental designs, and use qualitative methods to get this validity. You can obviously also have quantitative methods in there to get to the end of it. Okay, so then on to types of data. We've covered all of this really, quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative is really good if you want to be creating graphs, Venn diagrams, statistical analysis to go with it, but it does lack depth and detail. Qualitative data, it does have all that depth and detail, but it's really, really difficult to analyse. So then you've also got primary and secondary data. Okay, so primary data is what you collect first hand, right? Now that's good because it can really suit the aim of your research. However, it can take a lot of time and effort to actually collect that primary data, right? Secondary data is second-hand data. It was collected by someone else, right? So obviously this saves a lot of time. It's very easy to access. However, the studies that you have found might not actually fit directly what it is that you want to be finding out about. So they're not perfect. All right, then we've gone on to descriptive statistics. So this is a way of expressing numbers so that it gives an immediate understanding of what the overall pattern is. All right, so we might use things like you could use a scatter graph, you might use a columned graph, whatever, I can't think what else you'd call that, right? So but what you will need to do is consider the range, or how the dispersion of everything has been added, and then you will need to find averages. Again, I'm assuming we all know what mean, median and mode is. If you are not certain, look them up to make sure you know the difference. Okay, so then we have to interpret data, and we also have to display it. Right, so we might want to use frequency data and frequency tables, so we'll use the tally chart to get us to that idea. We could use a histogram to show what we've got. We could use a bar chart. We could look at normal distribution, so where we will have a bar chart showing the range across, and then we will put a line in to show where the highest level comes in that. Okay, finally we are on to computation, and this is all to do with maths. So we would have to think about, do we use decimals to show what we're presenting? Do we want to put it in fractions? Do we want ratios, percentages? You know, we need to think about what's our standard form that we're going to use, how many significant figures is that going to be to, and are we going to estimate the results, or are we going to be really precise in what we are doing?